heat of the Appalachian summer had always been a thing you felt deep in your teeth. A thick, smothering blanket of humidity, woven with the rank, sweet smell of pine needles, wet loam, and everything actively rotting beneath the canopy. It was the scent of life, rich and overwhelming, and for generations that was the way it had been. But around the middle of July, the air began to carry something else, a foreign note in the symphony of decay and growth, a distant metallic tang. The tang held the moisture in the air and froze it slightly. The scent was old iron left out in the rain, or blood that had been sterilized and dried, drifting down from the high ravines where the old mine shafts scored the mountainside like forgotten scars. The disappearances started quietly, easy enough to dismiss. A couple of hikers wandered off the path. A few locals simply packed up and decided to start over somewhere that did not smell so much like turpentine and mildew. They blamed bears, old forgotten pit traps, or bad judgment in country that held no patience for tourists. But the numbers kept adding up, and the pattern, once invisible, started to emerge with chilling clarity. Howard, the ranger, a tall, bony man whose face looked permanently surprised by the weather, knew the woods better than he knew his own worn kitchen linoleum. For 2 weeks he had not found a single body, not one shred of flesh that a bear had not already claimed. What he found were signs of sudden absolute cessation. Abandoned backpacks with the zippers still fully drawn, a neat pile of spent rifle casings gathered next to a boulder, by an alien hand, the kind of precision you only see when someone stopped shooting mid-clip because the threat vanished, or because the shooter was gone. Howard, trudging the trails in his stiff, dirt-caked boots, kept his silence. But the emptiness of the scene spoke volumes. There were no drag marks. There was no blood splash that he could not explain away as a minor injury. It was too clean. The truth began to surface only when it touched the experts, the people whose entire lives were predicated on reading the landscape. A hunter named Bobby, who specialized in tracking the rare mountain cougar, a creature that moves like smoke, found them near a low, mossy creek bed. Prints. They were not boot prints, and not the heavy, splayed paw prints of a bear or a wild dog. These were simultaneously savage and impossibly neat. They were large, longer than any wolf print, and carried the weight of a heavy animal, maybe 300 pounds, but they did not sink deep into the moist earth. They did not drag. They were placed with a terrible, surgical precision, each pad sinking only enough to gain purchase before lifting clean away. Bobby described them later, his voice thin and ragged. Tracks a large predator left while wearing hard, polished shoes. It was the detail that turned the stomach, suggesting not a beast of instinct, but a beast of calculation. The most terrifying phenomenon, however, was auditory. It happened only after the sun had fully set, and the natural, heavy chorus of the mountain night was at its peak. The rustle of 1,000 million leaves, the frantic chirping of insects, the distant, mournful cry of a great horned owl. And then, without warning, the sound stopped instantly, like someone had flipped a massive, invisible circuit breaker, cutting the current to the entire forest. The silence was absolute, a perfect vacuum where sound should be. It lasted only 10 seconds, the absolute maximum, but it left behind a deafening emptiness, an intolerable sense that the whole mountain simply stopped breathing, waiting for a predator whose step was lighter than air. The dogmen, whose territories lay far down the slopes where the forest floor was thickest, and the air was perpetually damp and warm, were the first of the hidden races to face the direct consequences. They were large, powerful creatures in their shifted form, relying on sheer bulk, ferocious instinct, and an olfactory sense that tracked a rabbit's fear from half a mile away. The loss of their junior scout was not immediate. He simply did not return. When they found him 2 days later, tucked into a clump of rhododendron bushes, he was unnaturally pale. His body was intact, without the usual signs of bear or mountain lion trauma. What unsettled them was the cold. His thick, normally searingly warm, dark russet coat was icy to the touch, and the flesh beneath felt like chilled river stone. Warg, the leader of the pack, a massive dogman whose hide was the color of dark rye bread, felt the familiar earth tremble under his heavy paws. It was not the tremor of fear, which he knew well. This was a shiver of incomprehension. This cold was alien, intrusive. Warg lowered his head over the fallen scout. He sniffed the body and the surrounding air with meticulous, grinding effort. There was no scent of wolf, none of the sour musk of a bear, not even the salty tang of human. Only that faint, sharp, rusted blood aroma and an impossible, dry cold that sank through his dense fur right into his bones. His nose, his ancient, trustworthy connection to the world, gave him nothing usable. The entire pack of dogmen experienced a profound, debilitating shift in perception. They had always been creatures of instinct, guided by the infallible language of scent and the subtle shifts in the wind. Now their senses were failing. They saw fast-moving shadows, white blurs against the perpetual dark green of the underbrush, and they heard a low-frequency rumble, too deep for hearing, that vibrated in the organs of their chests, triggering nausea and an incipient panic that tasted like raw copper. The vibration suggested immense power being unleashed and contained. That night, they performed the oldest rite, burning the scout's body on a hasty, searing pyre of pine and old gasoline cans found near a deserted logging trail, hoping to destroy whatever poison had taken him. As the sickly sweet smell of burning fur and the hot metallic scent of the wood smoke curled into the sky, Warg turned and looked toward the opposite slope, shrouded in the absolute black shadow of the higher peaks. And there they were, 12 pairs of eyes. They did not reflect the light of the fire. They generated a pale, chilling light of their own. The pupils were vertical, thin, like slivers of ice inserted into the darkness. They were too tall, too still, and they pulsed with a hunger that was not for flesh, but for heat. Warg felt the cold radiating across the valley, a palpable wave of absolute zero. He knew, with the horrible certainty that only a predator can know about another predator, that whatever had arrived in their woods had not come for a meal. It had come for everything that kept them warm. The war for the American dark had begun, signaled only by a cold, metallic smell and the cessation of all sound. High above the tangled, humid world of the dogmen, the werewolves lived. Their territory clung to the craggy, wind-whipped ledges and narrow, rocky ravines where the soil was thin, and the wind whistled a perpetual, scraping song through the cracks. They were a harder, more disciplined clan than the volatile dogmen, their bodies leaner, their coats often darker, built for speed and endurance on difficult terrain. Gray, their leader, was a study in cold, muscular efficiency. In his shifted form, he possessed short, midnight dark fur and an unnervingly human gaze, a look that confirmed endless calculation rather than primal impulse. Gray, initially, was unmoved by the vanishing human population and the strange happenings down below. He instructed his pack to remain strictly within the high crags. He dismissed the initial reports as predictable strife between the wilder dogmen and the always meddling humans. Let them destroy each other, was the unspoken rule. The mountain will keep the secrets of the mountain. But the losses began to mount in his own ranks, and they were illogical, undermining his carefully maintained order. It was not the inexperienced youths or the infirm who vanished. It was their best. The most seasoned scouts, the quietest hunters, those who navigated the sheer rock faces blindfolded. They disappeared not in struggle or noise, but with the silence of a breath being held permanently. All they ever left behind were the slightest indicators. A small pile of fine white ash, where a creature of warmth had been, or a faintly etched mark on a piece of granite where something moist and impossibly cold had briefly touched the stone and instantly dried. Gray patrolled the lower boundaries himself, a silent, dark blur against the moon-washed scree. He caught the scent then, the same one Warg had noted far below. It was not the rich, fermented scent of old decay or the mineral tang of natural blood. It was clean, like the steel of a surgical instrument left out in the snow. A precise metallic coldness that did not just register in the nose, but pierced the sinuses. It was not the smell of an animal. It was the scent of rock, of metal, of something fundamentally non-biological that had been violently awakened. It was during the deep blue light of the pre-dawn, when the fog clung thick and wet to the upper slopes, that Gray found the clearest evidence. He stumbled onto a small clearing, a flat table of rock used by the local deer herds. The whites, whoever or whatever they were, had not been meticulous enough here. Hanging from a low branch of a scrub oak was the ruin of a large buck. It was not ripped apart by claws or teeth. It was meticulously, clinically, hollowed out. The bone structure was complete, but the bones themselves were white as bleached chalk and utterly, impossibly dry. All moisture, all blood, all warmth had been extracted with the precision of a laboratory pump. Standing adjacent to the remains, partially obscured by the swirling icy mist, was an imprint of the hunter. Gray saw it clearly before the wind shifted the fog. A white, gaunt silhouette, unnervingly tall, stood motionless in the freezing vapor. It was a physical presence that absorbed every flicker of light. Gray, whose mind was a steel trap trained by centuries of tracking and preying, grasped the horrific calculus immediately. These things did not hunt for sustenance. They hunted for energy. They were not wasteful. They left no discernible waste products, no messy viscera, nothing that would compromise the environment. Their objective was not the consumption of flesh, but the harvesting of internal heat. The thought of an enemy whose sole interest was the temperature of his living body, not his existence, triggered a deep, primal revulsion that transcended fear. It was an existential affront. Finally convinced that the threat was not merely local or a problem for the less disciplined dogmen, Gray led a small recon unit down toward the dense forest where the dogmen held sway. They moved with absolute silence, using the cover of the thick rhododendrons and heavy laurel patches. They found the dogmen, usually so loud and careless, moving with uncharacteristic caution, low to the ground, almost crawling. It was then that the silence broke. The attack was sudden and breathtakingly swift. The whites launched themselves from the upper branches of the colossal hemlocks, dropping like white, scythe-like shadows. The entire event lasted less than 3 seconds. The enemy sought to create chaos and division. The ambush scattered the dogmen. Warg, roaring in fury and confusion, was scrambling to regain control when Gray, having seen the impossible speed and vertical lift of the attackers, emerged from the brush. The two leaders, Warg and Gray, beings who were genetically programmed to tear each other's throats out over territory disputes, met in the smoky, dust-filled clearing where the dogman had vanished. The sharp smell of the dogman's agitated musk hung in the air, mixing with the sterile coldness of the vanished foe. Both leaders stared down at the remnants of the struggle, the deep, perfectly molded tracks that suggested an unnatural weight and precision, heading due west toward the deep, unvisited ravines. The ancient, calcified hatred between their two races receded entirely, replaced by a common, undeniable horror. They were both prey now, hunted by something that defied the very laws of life in the Appalachians. The negotiations, if they could be called that, took place at an old, long-abandoned sawmill tucked into a bowl in the foothills. The place was a skeletal ruin of rusted corrugated steel, collapsing timber, and silent, heavy machinery, a perfect monument to ruin and a fitting stage for the potential end of their world. Warg, the dogman leader, arrived first, his massive frame radiating raw, impatient fury. He spoke in growls and clipped, gravelly phrases demanding immediate, overwhelming retaliation. His logic was simple. Fight fire with fire, or in this case, fight cold with immediate, searing violence. Gray, the werewolf, arrived with 2 of his most trusted subordinates, moving with the quiet grace of a man walking into a church or a morgue. He was cold, analytical, clinical in his assessment. He saw Warg's rage as a dangerous liability. Strategy, Gray insisted, must precede slaughter. Gray used his acute powers of observation to explain the nature of their new enemy. They are not the walking dead, not ghosts, not even wolves, Gray hissed, his voice low and precise, cutting through the heavy air of the mill. They are specialized organisms. They absorb heat. They drain moisture. They leave behind only dry, pale envelopes. He recounted the impossibly clean kill sites and the surgical nature of the deer carcass. Their ability to camouflage, to move unseen, and their reaction speed exceeds any natural predator we know in these mountains. They are not hunting us, Warg. They are processing us. Warg, still clinging to the doctrine of blind, powerful attack, resisted until the werewolves showed him the evidence they had gathered from the higher, less frequented caves. They had found bodies, not just the dried husks of hikers or deer, but several of their own kind, both dogmen and werewolves, who had vanished in previous decades. The bodies were completely exsanguinated, bleached white, and perfectly preserved in the unnatural, pervasive cold of the mountain's depths. This was not a sudden invasion. It was an escalating purge. It was not simple hunting. It was a threat to the biological continuity of their species. This, Gray concluded, pointing a claw at the image of a bleached dogman, is not sport. This is extinction. Warg finally acquiesced, the sound of his agreement a guttural cough that rattled the rusted tin walls of the mill shed. Then we hunt them, but we hunt them together. We move like one beast. The mixed squad was formed, 7 total. 3 werewolves, Gray, Carr, and Lysander, all speed, discipline, and stealth. 4 dogmen, Warg, Gorok, Borok, and Ragan, all heavy muscle, immense strength, and incandescent fury. The formation of the unit was fraught with ancient, biting distrust. The dogmen found the werewolves' silence maddening, interpreting it as cold arrogance. The werewolves found the dogmen's heavy footfalls and short tempers a liability that would get them all terminated. Every shared glance, every overlapping shadow, was thick with ancestral resentment. They began to move, following the thin, metallic scent trail that was becoming sharper, more undeniable. The trail led them through a meadow near a stream, and it was here that the sensory assault became critical. They walked through grass that died instantly beneath their heavy paws, turning brittle and gray just seconds after being touched. It was not frost. It was a cessation of vitality, something that leached the very principle of life out of everything it encountered. The horror escalated. Gorak, the youngest and most volatile of the dogmen, suddenly froze. He gagged, pressing a paw to his throat. "My spit," he rasped, his eyes wide and yellow. "It's freezing in my mouth." Gray motioned the team to stop. He looked up, using his night-adapted eyes to peer through the impossibly dense layer of pine needles and heavy conifer boughs that obscured the sky. They were being watched. They saw the eyes again, not reflecting light, but functioning as thin, crystalline lenses through which only cosmic, non-solar cold filtered. Warg, already strained to the breaking point by the unnatural silence and the sickening sensation of the cold, roared softly, frustrated by the werewolves' measured pace. "We attack, before this fear turns us into statues." Gray's response was immediate and firm. "Haste is their greatest weapon against your kind, Warg. They feed on chaos." He pointed to the crystalline eyes above. "They are using fear to separate us. We move only when necessary, only at night when their alien cold is less taxing on us, and we must learn to trust what we feel, not what our eyes show us." It was a bitter pill, but the evidence of the dead grass and the paralyzed dogman was overwhelming. Warg, breathing heavily, spat onto the ground, the saliva instantly freezing on the brittle earth. He nodded once, acknowledging the supremacy of the werewolf's strategy. Their first unified doctrine of war was established. Absolute cohesion, never separate, back to back. Trust the sound, trust the smell, distrust the sight. The tracking, slow and painful, brought the fragile alliance to an area of recent human activity, a small, seasonal logging camp that should have been teeming with the scent of diesel, sweat, and cheap coffee. Instead, they stepped into a pocket of perfect stillness. The camp looked entirely untouched. The fire pit was cold, but the logs were still arranged for lighting. Food cans lay scattered around a makeshift table, exactly where the men had left them. But inside the tents, the scene was a tableau of horror. 4 men were sitting around the central card table, positioned in their chairs as if arrested mid-game. Their eyes were wide open, gazing blankly at the mildewed canvas ceiling. Their skin, normally tanned and ruddy, possessed an unnatural, sickly sheen, like old, cracked porcelain. They sat frozen eternally mid-sentence. Warg, unable to accept the visual evidence, approached one of the lumberjacks. His colossal paw, usually radiating heat, hesitated before touching the man's shoulder. The sensation was immediate and profound. Not cold in the sense of ice, but the dead, polished chill of fresh-cut white marble. The bodies were perfectly preserved, without any apparent damage, devoid of blood and moisture. They were exhibits. Carr, whose olfactory senses were specialized even among his clan for tracing faint mineral deposits, began sniffing the ground around the perimeter. He dug his claws into the damp, decaying leaf litter, pulling up a network of delicate, incredibly resilient organic fibers that resembled fine, pale spider silk. "Not nets," Gray murmured, bending low, careful not to touch the material. "Conduits. They use them to draw off the heat and cause immediate subtle paralysis. They paralyze, then they drain. It explains the lack of struggle." As the squad studied the horrific display, the air above them began to vibrate. It was not the sound of wing beats or branches snapping. It was a high-pitched, inaudible whistle, a pure ultra-frequency that did not enter the ear but pressed painfully against the inner workings of the skull. The dogmen, whose primal natures were already stretched thin by the unnatural phenomena, began to panic. Gorok, the young dogman whose mouth had frozen in the previous clearing, clamped his paws over his ears, his yellow eyes wide with raw terror. The ultrasonic attack had fractured his perception. He saw Gray, the dark, disciplined werewolf, not as an ally but as a towering, pale silhouette, one of the others. With a choked roar of confusion, Gorok launched himself toward Gray, rage and misdirection fueling his every sinew. Warg, faster than anyone expected, intercepted Gorok mid-air, tackling his subordinate and slamming him hard into a pile of stacked 2x4s. The lumber cracked like pistol shots, but the momentary chaos was enough. From the deep shadow of an ancient moss-covered oak, a wight sprang out. It did not charge. It glided. It moved not to eliminate, but to punish and divide. A second wight dropped onto the upper branches, seizing the slight frame of Lysander, one of the werewolf scouts. There was no scream, just a choked gasp, and the body was hauled straight up into the oppressive darkness of the canopy, leaving a faint, sharp scent of ozone and pulverized pine needles. Lysander was gone, abducted, status, missing in action. The creature barely slowed down as it passed the flank of another dogman, Borok, leaving a surgical, impossibly thin, deep slash along his ribs. Then it was gone, dissolving into the visual static of the surrounding woods before anyone, even Gray, could twitch a claw in defense. Borok staggered back, eyes blinking slowly. He did not roar in pain. He gasped in a growing coldness. He felt no immediate agony, but he felt the sudden alarming sensation of his own blood thickening, turning sluggish and cold as mercury inside his veins. The wound, despite the dogman's massive muscle mass, was leaching heat at an alarming rate. Gray reacted with brutal speed, overriding the remaining dogman's confused protests. He spotted an old half-full barrel of pitch and pine tar used for sealing lumber, still hot from the day's sun before the loggers vanished. He forced Borok down, and before the dogman could truly register the agony, Gray plunged a heavy metal spoon into the boiling, viscous tar and slammed the steaming mass directly onto the freezing wound. The dogman howled, a sound of searing, legitimate pain, not the psychic dread of the cold, as the hot, black substance cauterized and sealed the injury, forcing the remaining heat back into his body. The action saved Borok's life, but the violence of the quick fix further frayed the trust between the two factions. As the remaining allies stabilized, Ragn, the fourth dogman, suddenly collapsed. His skin, untouched by visible trauma, turned the sickly pale shade of porcelain. He had been brushed by a wight during the chaos, and the subtle, localized cryo wound had bypassed the urgency of the moment, killing him slowly from within. Ragn was dead within minutes, his body left behind as a chalky monument to the wight's surgical precision. After the attack, Warg was forced into a bitter reckoning. The whites had not sought direct confrontation, they sought panic and separation. Their weapons were psychological, ultra-frequencies and precision strikes. "We move as one body," Warg rumbled, tasting the metallic fear on the air. Gray's command on movement stands. If we break rank, we break for good. The formula of movement became scripture. Never separate, move back to back, trusting the sound and the scent, and ignoring the terrifying visual deceptions. They understood now that the white was not just a hunter, it was a maestro of dread. The survivors, Gray, Warg, Carr, and Borak, looked upon the carnage. Lysander was lost, Ragn was dead, and Gorak was too disoriented to continue with the unit. They pressed on, a unit of 4, following the metallic scent trail. The thin metallic scent, now laced with a sickly sweetness that hinted at the white's presence, led the 4 surviving allies, Warg, Gray, Carr the scout, and Borak the wounded dogman, into the mountain's deepest, most forgotten cavity. They followed the tracks to the mouth of the old, defunct coal mine, a black square maw pressed deep into the hillside. The air that poured out of the tunnel was not just cold. It was an active, corrosive chill, a dead, grave-like frost impossible in the middle of a warm Appalachian summer. It suggested not the mere absence of heat, but the active presence of something fundamentally cold. Inside the shaft, the atmosphere was suffocating. The air was heavy with ancient methane, the smell of damp earth, and a thick, ferrous scent of rust. But underneath it all, both Warg and Carr identified an undertone of desiccated fear, a highly concentrated aroma of sheer crystallized terror left behind by those who had passed through before. Water dripped somewhere far off, but the sound was amplified to an unnatural degree, echoing like the deliberate striking of a heavy hammer on rock. They moved slowly. Flashlights scavenged from the logging camp and filtered to reduce glare, cutting weak beams through the absolute blackness. After perhaps a quarter mile, the tunnel opened into a series of large, excavated chambers. Here, among the ancient, dusty equipment and derelict mine carts, they found the whites' dreadful handiwork. Dozens of the old wooden coal carts had been transformed into display cases. They were filled, neatly and horrifyingly, with bodies. Not just the bleached white lumberjacks and hikers, but the husks of black bears, mountain lions, and a whole pack of feral wolves. All were perfectly preserved, their eyes open, their tissues bone dry. This was no casual hunting ground. It was a highly organized storage facility, meticulously maintained by the pervasive cold. Carr, sweeping his light across the dusty rock walls, noticed something else. Vertical scoring, deeply etched into the stone. They were not natural fissures. They were frantic, angular scratch marks. Gray recognized the pattern instantly. It was the desperate attempt at communication from their own kind. Werewolves and dogmen who had vanished in years prior, sometimes decades, long before the recent flurry of disappearances. The crushing realization settled upon them. The whites had not just arrived. They had been hunting them always, selectively and secretly, using the depths of the mountain as their silent larder. The silence was shattered by a low, persistent vibration that originated not from the rock, but from above. Small clouds of coal dust rained down from the ceiling. Warg felt the shudder in his feet and understood instantly. "They're outside," Warg rasped, his voice bouncing off the damp stone. "On the mountain, They are bringing the tunnel down. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. The group turned to bolt back toward the light, but it was too late. From a narrow side shaft, two whites appeared. They did not attack with speed, but with impossible stillness, utilizing the sudden paralyzing darkness. Their forms were gaunt, elongated, and their eyes, catching the faint reflection of the lanterns, shone with that sickly pale luminescence. The ensuing fight was a blind, chaotic struggle. The only guidance was the reeking scent of the creatures, the sound of tearing stone, and the panicked, heavy breathing of the allies. Warg, relying on pure, unadulterated mass, managed to catch one of the whites. He used his immense hardened forearm like a club, delivering a blow that took the creature's head completely off its neck. The body collapsed, heavy and surprisingly inert. But the second white, demonstrating an impossible mastery of vertical movement, scaled the rough-hewn ceiling, moving with the silence of a lizard. It dropped onto Carr, the disciplined werewolf scout. Carr let out a short, guttural sound of shock, immediately cut off, as if the sound itself had been physically scrubbed from the air. The white dragged Carr's body instantly and effortlessly into the black, unmapped side shaft. Gray roared, a sound of absolute devastating loss, and fired a burst of claws into the fading silhouette, but struck only air. The passage was sealed by the falling rock and dust from the encroaching collapse. Carr was simply erased. The three survivors, Warg, Gray, and Borok, scrambled toward the entrance as the supporting timbers began to crack with the sound of cannon fire. They left behind the trophy gallery, the suffocating methane, and the devastating realization that the enemy fought not just with claw and speed, but with the entire architecture of the mountain. The remaining trio, Gray, Warg, and Borok, exploded from the collapsing mine mouth in a shower of coal dust, choking on sulfur and pulverized stone. They tumbled down the slope, barely managing to scramble free before the entire entrance caved in behind them with a shuddering final roar. They lay gasping on the wet earth, covered in soot and sweat, alive but battered, the smell of burnt rock and methane heavy in the air. Gray still held the head of the white warg had managed to destroy, clutching it tightly despite the unnerving cold radiating from the severed neck. As the sickly yellow moon began to dip toward the horizon, casting a weak, cold light, Gray examined the trophy. The white's skin was tough, bone-white and hairless, feeling less like organic tissue and more like some form of highly polished shellac. There was no visible blood, but the horror was inside. Beneath the thin, hard cranial bone, there was no recognizable brain structure. Instead, Gray saw a complex, tightly woven crystalline organ that pulsed with an intermittent, chilling blue light. "They are not of the blood, Warg," Gray whispered, his voice hoarse from the dust. "They are thermal engines." The horrifying realization dawned on them both simultaneously. These were not vampires in the mythological sense, feeding on blood and becoming undead. These were highly specialized, adapted predators whose biology was rooted in crystallization and the absorption of kinetic and thermal energy. Their strike was not merely a bite to draw blood. It introduced a paralyzing agent that acted as an instantaneous localized freezer, extracting warmth before they extracted life. Warg, using a heavy piece of fallen timber, probed the area around the collapsed entrance. He found the thin, wire-like filaments they had seen at the lumber camp, but here they were thicker, braided, and connected to the living roots of the surrounding pines. They used the forest as a nervous system, Warg rumbled, shaking his head slowly. Not just a place to hide, but a system of traps and alerts. They knew we were here before we reached the entrance. Their scouts watched us since we left the mill. As the true dawn began to push its way through the dense canopy, filtering the light, they noticed something crucial. When the direct low-angle rays of the sun struck the head Gray held, the crystalline organ within dimmed, and the skin became faintly translucent. The sun slows them, Borak noted, his voice still shaky from the encounter. Temporarily, Gray countered, tossing the head into a pile of wet leaves, where the chilling light immediately dimmed further. They know how to use the shadows. They are not destroyed by light. They are merely hampered. The tension that had simmered between the leaders finally boiled over. Warg pointed a heavy, shaking paw at Gray. "The wolf, your kind, was too slow. You brought us into a hole you couldn't defend." "Your kind," Gray snarled back, ignoring the pain in his own ribs, attracted them with noise and your panicked rage. The loss of Carr is on your impatience, Dogman. They stood poised for a fight, their heavy breathing audible in the sudden stillness of the dawn. Borak, the wounded dogman, intervened, placing himself awkwardly between them. "They used us," he whispered, spitting black dust. "They used our hate to split us." The shame of the realized truth was more immediate than their anger. They had been reacting on primal instinct, exactly as the enemy desired. Gray looked back at the smoke rising from the massive, fresh grave of the mine entrance. He knew they could not risk another subterranean move. The whites possessed an overwhelming environmental advantage in the cold, dark depths. A new, desperate plan formed in Gray's meticulous mind. If they could not defeat the whites in their element, the shadows and the crushing cold, they must force them into a terrain that amplified the Allies' strengths. They needed open ground, a large kill zone where pure physical force and the unleashed fury of their full transformations could be brought to bear without the risk of immediate surgical extraction. "We go back to the mill," Gray announced, his dark eyes fixed on Warg. "We use what's left of the metal, the open space. We lead them into the killing field, and we will make them fight us for every single yard." Warg, wiping the coal dust from his eyes, felt the grim weight of the decision. They were moving from defense to deliberate sacrifice. "If we fall, they will use our heat to finish the job," Warg muttered. "We won't just destroy them. We must erase them." The new stage of the war demanded absolute annihilation, not just simple dispatch. The long, arduous retreat began immediately. The goal was the old, abandoned sawmill, a structure of heavy, rusted steel that offered both open killing space and intricate opportunities for rigging traps. The three survivors moved south, heading for the edge of the deepest forest, toward ground more amenable to their specific kinds of savagery. The three allies, Gray, Warg, and Borak, reached the old sawmill just as the cold of the high night began to bite. They moved with meticulous caution, implementing their new doctrine. They utilized false trails, covering their true scent with animal musk and the decaying odors of the forest floor, attempting to confuse the high-tuned olfactory senses of the enemy. Warg, massive and radiating residual body heat, was the primary target, the decoy. The whites, however, did not rely solely on scent. They tracked thermal signatures. Werg felt the insidious effect of their presence constantly, a faint, needle-sharp tingling along his spine, the sense that unseen eyes were actively scanning his biological warmth through the dense layers of his fur. This invisible sensory duel was exhausting, draining their reserves faster than physical exertion. As they crossed a wide meadow of tall, deadened grass, the air filled with a suffocating, almost cloying scent. Sickly sweet, like overripe fruit that had begun to ferment, mixed with something sharp and metallic. "Smell that," Borak hissed, his lips peeling back from his teeth. "Makes my head spin." Gray recognized it immediately. It is not natural. It is a biological agent, a neurotoxin. It attacks the brain, causes hallucinations, paralyzes the primal senses. The whites were attempting to dismantle their instincts piece by piece. They were forced to cover their noses and rely purely on Gray's iron will and their own sense of physical alignment to keep moving. They ran into the hunters sooner than planned. They emerged from a screen of hemlocks and found two whites perched atop a colossal fallen pine, bleached white against the darkness. They were utterly motionless. They were not hiding. They were waiting, observing. Their behavior confirmed Gray's earlier assessment. These were strategists, not mere beasts of prey. They were allowing the Allies to exhaust themselves. "They look like they're carved from dry ice," Warg growled, adjusting his massive bulk to shield Borak. Gray seized the tactical initiative. They could not afford to run, not when the enemy was already positioned to observe and attack at their leisure. "We need cover," Gray commanded. "Smoke. Block their line of sight. Confuse the thermal read." They had carried a small emergency supply of fire-starting equipment. Using dry, resinous pine, wet moss, and old oily cloth scavenged from the logging camp, they quickly built a thick, slow-burning pyre. The flames were weak, but the smoke was immediate and noxious, a thick, black, oily cloud that settled close to the ground, obscuring movement and disrupting the whites' optical and thermal targeting systems. The skirmish that followed in the opaque, acrid cloud was short and brutal. Warg, roaring defiance, used his body as a blunt instrument, rolling across the ground to knock one of the whites off its perch. The creature was fast, but hampered by the smoke. Gray, moving with the terrifying speed of a striking viper, used the momentary distraction. He vaulted over the struggling dogman and white, catching the second creature by the base of the skull. His claws, honed to razor sharpness, moved like hooks, twisting and snapping the neck with a sickening, audible crack. A moment of silence followed the sickening sound, broken only by their ragged breathing and the crackle of the improvised fire. They had won, but at a cost. Borak, trying to hold down the first white, had managed to crush its ribcage, but not before the creature's skin, impossibly cold, had left a deep, painful burn on his flank, a cryogenic injury. Warg stood over the dispatched whites, their bodies inert and unnervingly white in the moonlight filtered through the smoke. He used the tip of a discarded logging axe to prod the neck of the one Gray had broken. He confirmed the terrible truth Gray had suspected. There was no seepage, no blood, no fluid, not even the moisture of internal organs. It was clean, dry, purely organic tissue that crumbled slightly under the pressure. "Machines," Warg declared, the word tasting like defeat. "We are fighting things that are not alive." This realization brought with it a cold terror that eclipsed even the psychic dread they felt. They were not fighting living beings whose death might sate them. They were fighting an environmental force, and the only way to win was to dismantle the machinery entirely. They knew now that only total destruction, eliminating all traces, could prevent the chilling recycling of their enemy. The two surviving werewolves, Gray, the leader, and Warg, the dogman, reached the old sawmill just as the cold of the high night began to bite. It was a sprawling, hideous landscape of industrial decay, massive flaking steel girders, heaps of rusted chains, broken concrete, and a fine layer of coal dust that coated everything. It was exactly the open killing ground Gray had sought, a place where the enemy could not easily utilize the canopy and where the Allied fighters used the bulk and obstacles to their advantage. They immediately began preparing. Warg, despite his exhaustion, used his monumental strength to rig up dangerous booby traps, positioning massive, waterlogged steel beams so they could be dropped with minimal force, looping heavy, rusted chains through broken windows to use as improvised whips or snares. The dogman's raw power was perfectly suited to manipulating the heavy junk metal. Gray, meticulous and silent, focused on the placement of explosive dust and creating clear lines of retreat, anticipating the whites' every vector of attack. Then came the waiting. The silence was heavier than the steel. The temperature dropped steadily, sinking into the mid-40s, a frigid, alien cold that amplified the steel's own chill. They were forced to move constantly, not to warm up, but to keep the blood flowing against the insidious, penetrating frost. Gray and Warg finally stood together in the center of the largest shed, backed up against a wall of decaying conveyor belts. They did not speak. All pretense of animosity was gone, replaced by a deep, symbiotic combat reliance. The air was too thick with dread for casual conversation. Suddenly, the absolute quiet of the night shattered, replaced by a chilling cacophony. The whites had arrived. They did not just walk. They used sound as a weapon. They began to mimic the sounds of their lost comrades. The faint, broken sobs of the missing humans, the desperate cut-off gasp of the lost werewolf scout, Carr, and the agonized snarl of Lysander. It was a calculated, brutal attempt to shatter their resolve. Warg, his teeth bared in a silent snarl of fury, fought the urge to rush the sound. He kept his eyes fixed on the surrounding shadows. Through a large, shattered window opening, Warg saw them. 7. They were moving across the field outside, a terrifying synchronized front. They did not crawl or stalk. They walked with cold, measured certainty, insolently. They knew their enemy was trapped, and they knew their power. Gray, his breathing ragged but controlled, finally spoke. His voice low enough to be lost to the wind if it was not for Warg standing shoulder to shoulder with him. If they win, Warg, nothing remains here but the white emptiness. Then we make them pay, Warg responded, his voice a dry, rasping promise. We will make them take every single piece of heat we have to offer. It was a death pact and a mutual final testament. The attack came not with a charge, but with a terrifying vertical descent. 3 of the creatures leaped from the high, dilapidated roof of the main shed. They landed with near silence, their elongated limbs absorbing the shock perfectly. The fight began not with a roar, but with a deafening metallic shriek as one of the whites slammed into a steel girder, initiating the inevitable final clash. The battle inside the ruined sawmill was a blinding chaos of tearing metal, spraying rust, and the high, whining sound of the whites' movement. Warg became a living battering ram. His bulk used to rip and tear at the crystalline flesh of the attackers, turning them into white shrapnel. Gray moved with the lightning speed of his kind, aiming for the joints, the thin, brittle points of articulation that might crack the seemingly impenetrable structure. Borok, the wounded dogman, engaged one of the creatures, managing to pin its limbs against a massive, rusting flywheel. He felt his claws sink satisfyingly into the tough, resistant flesh. But in that same instant, Borok let out a strangled, horrific cry that transcended physical pain. The white, dying, pressed its palm against Borok's chest. The dogman's dark fur began to rapidly whiten, the deep color leaching out as if rinsed by an invisible corrosive solvent. Borok felt a sickening, burning cold spread from the point of contact, a devastating realization that his life force, his sheer physical heat, was being pulled from him. This was instantaneous, agonizing assimilation. He became chalky, frozen, a statue of horror. Warg, consumed by white-hot rage at the loss of his brother, ignored the rising dread. He turned his focus to the white that stood over the quickly petrifying Borok. Warg embraced the creature in a final, lethal hug. He slammed the white against a rusted steel lever protruding from a wall, using the sheer leverage of his powerful body to break the creature's spine with a sickening crunch. As the white ceased moving, Warg felt a strange, momentary sensation. A rush of unbelievable, searing heat and power surged through his own body, a byproduct of the enemy's final, catastrophic failure. He released the inert corpse, staggering back, but he was alive. Warg and Gray, momentarily shielded by the falling detritus of the brief, brutal exchange, watched in terror. They realized the terrifying logic behind the white's methodology. Death was not a failure for them. It was an opportunity. Each time they eliminated a dogman or a werewolf, they were not just reducing enemy numbers. They were absorbing the very biological qualities of their prey: speed, aggression, physical mass, resilience. This chilling realization was given immediate, horrific form. One of the surviving whites, which had been fighting the doomed dogman, now moved differently. Its attacks were heavier, imbued with impossible muscular force. It did not just glide, it jumped with the powerful, ground-eating leap that only a dogman possessed. It had genetically upgraded itself in the space of 3 minutes. Gray felt a cold despair seize him. They were not fighting an army that could be defeated through attrition. They were fighting a process of forced evolution. Every death they caused, every sacrifice they made the remaining enemy stronger, more perfect. Their alliance, intended to maximize their combined strength, had become the predictable testing ground for the whites' own genetic modernization. Now they were 2, Gray and Warg, against 3 of the whites, one of which was a devastating hybrid biological machine. They understood the new terrible rule. They could not just kill them. They had to annihilate them in such a way that no assimilation, no energy transfer was possible. Their target had to be the system, not the individual. Gray's mind, racing at full capacity, found the solution amidst the wreckage. He pointed Warg toward the center of the main shed, a massive, horribly rusted, multi-ton steam turbine, long defunct, which used to power the whole milling operation. It was surrounded by a nest of broken, razor-sharp metallic gears and supports. The core, Gray gasped, pointing toward the heavy mass, the strongest one. We lure it into the mechanism. We destroy it utterly. Warg understood the suicidal nature of the task. He would be the distraction. Using his remaining energy, he began a terrifying, chaotic rampage. He used a section of heavy I-beam like a club, smashing against the remaining machinery, creating a deafening cacophony and raising thick clouds of coal dust and metal shavings. He drew the focus of the hybrid white. The hybrid, now possessing the crushing weight and explosive speed it had assimilated, pursued Warg with cold, focused fury. It ignored the smaller, faster werewolf. The pursuit was immediate, relentless. The hybrid white did not bother with the ultrasonic attack. It relied on pure physical destruction. It struck Warg in the flank, a blow that hit him like a train. Warg's massive body slammed against a steel support pillar, and he felt the sickening crack of multiple ribs. He gasped, but he refused to fall. He was bait, but he was also a lethal deterrent. Meanwhile, Gray, moving with superhuman stealth, utilized the highest steel rafters. He was not attacking the white. He was attacking the turbine's supports. His claws, controlled by millennia of discipline, targeted the old compromised bolts and rivets that anchored the behemoth to the concrete floor. He moved like a shadow on the thin steel beams, slicing through the rust-weakened metal with perfect precision. Warg, tasting blood, knew he had only seconds left. He made one final, desperate move. He feigned exhaustion, stumbling back just as the hybrid white launched its most powerful attack. The creature, propelled by its newly acquired dogman musculature, surged forward. The white missed Warg entirely, finding itself squarely beneath the towering, precarious mass of the multi-ton turbine. That was the exact second Gray finished his surgical work on the last support strut. The turbine fell. It did not crash. It descended with the overwhelming, cataclysmic inevitability of mass. The resulting sound was beyond deafening. A horrifying metal-on-metal scream that was instantly followed by the deep, grinding crunch of pulverized concrete and steel. Warg and Gray staggered back, shielding their eyes. The turbine and the massive flywheel assembly twisted and collapsed, reducing the immediate area to a churning slurry of metal and rock. When the dust began to settle, there was no sign of the hybrid white. The sheer, overwhelming pressure had ground the creature into fine, white, non-organic dust, which was already dissipating into the heavy metal-scented air. There was no tissue, no form, no heat left for assimilation. They had achieved annihilation. The silence that followed was absolute. For the first time since the whites' invasion began, the silence was natural. Not the manufactured acoustic vacuum of the predator, but the exhausted quiet of a finished fight. All that could be heard was the ragged, heaving gasps of the two survivors, coated in oil, rust, and dust. They had destroyed the creature, but the cost had been catastrophic. Gray and Warg lay side by side on the cold concrete floor, amid the shrapnel and bent steel. Their bodies were a ruin of shredded muscle and deep contusions. Warg's ribs were splintered, and Gray was bleeding sluggishly from half a dozen razor-thin cuts. The primal urge to fight was entirely spent, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. They stared at the ceiling, their heavy breathing the only sound in the ruin. They had won the battle. They looked at each other across the wreckage, not with animosity, but with the cold, shared horror of those who had passed through fire together. As they rested, waiting for the first tentative rays of sun, Warg lifted his head. The faint light on the eastern horizon was not clear. It was obscured by a massive, dense cloud, not of coal dust but of fog. This was no ordinary mountain mist. It was thick, unnaturally white, and it flowed horizontally, a smooth, dense river of vapor clinging to the earth. And from that flow, shapes emerged. They were impossibly still, impossibly white. 5. They moved not with the aggressive, panicked haste of the scouts they had been fighting, but with a terrifying, slow, disciplined precision. They were marching. This was not a recon unit. This was the main force. A cold, agonizing awareness settled over Warg, heavier than the fallen turbine. He pushed himself up onto one forearm, fighting the blinding pain. He realized with shattering clarity the fights, the ambushes, the losses, the assimilation of their dead. All of it had been part of a systematic test. The whites had not been hunting them to feed. They had been stress testing their combined defenses, analyzing the limits of their discipline, their rage, and their ability to cooperate. The moment the hybrid white was destroyed, the testing phase ended. Now, with a clear understanding of the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, the true invasion began. Gray, the analytical one, was struck silent, his logic centers screaming in denial. Warg, the impulsive dogman, became the grim prophet. He watched the approaching figures with a terrible, bleak calm. "They know," Warg rasped, his voice barely audible. "They know exactly how to break us now." The sight of the second wave, moving with such implacable certainty, was a psychological devastation far worse than the fight itself. They had sacrificed their entire unit only to provide the enemy with a perfect combat analysis. Using their remaining negligible reserves of adrenaline, Gray and Warg began to crawl out of the ruin. They couldn't fight. Not like this, not against that organized, tested front. Their only recourse was retreat, to warn what little remained of their separate, shattered clans. Their bodies screamed in protest, refusing to obey. They moved on pure will, fueled only by the dreadful certainty of the approaching catastrophe. As they slipped into the remaining tree line, the air around them was no longer localized. The metallic, freezing scent was everywhere, spreading through the whole valley. The Appalachians, their home, no longer smelled of pine and damp earth. They smelled of galvanized steel and absolute, encroaching cold. Survival, they realized, was no longer about winning a single fight. It was about not being absorbed, not becoming a perfect, white exhibit in the endless frozen museum of the mountain. Gray and Warg moved through the high northern slopes of the forest for 2 full days, moving only in shadow, driven by the knowledge that the main force of the whites was methodically sweeping the lower valleys. When they finally staggered back to their respective clan territories, they were spectral figures, their fur matted with dried blood, their movements stiff and broken. Their return was not a triumph, but a harrowing omen. The surviving werewolves, fewer than 30 now, stared at Gray's ravaged, exhausted frame in shock. The dogmen looked at the defeated, silent Warg with utter incomprehension. In the ensuing council, held in a deep, hidden cave far above the tree line, the leaders laid out the chilling truth. They spoke of the biological nature of the whites, of their ability to assimilate strength and adapt instantly. They explained that this was not a war against blood drinkers, but against engineers of chaos who used the very environment as a weapon. The final vestiges of mistrust between the clans shattered, replaced by a common, cold debilitating dread. The old animosities were irrelevant. They were now two factions facing a single existential threat. The Appalachian landscape itself was beginning to change. Low-lying areas where the whites had passed were now coated in a fine, white, dry moss. The dense forest was becoming eerily quiet, the normal rustling life subdued by the perpetual encroaching chill. Hunting had become a terrifying risk. The two races were forced to evacuate traditional hunting grounds, crowding into shared, difficult shelters where they could pool resources and maintain some semblance of warmth. The need for cooperation was no longer a tactical debate. It was a biological imperative. The werewolves and dogmen formally sealed a pact, an immediate total merger of resources, knowledge, and defenses. Gray, the disciplined strategist, began to teach the remaining dogmen the crucial importance of silence and precise movement. Warg, the brute force, taught the lighter, faster werewolves techniques of endurance and how to channel their rage into sustained, targeted fury. They were preparing for a long, grinding war. The final, terrifying insight confirmed their greatest fear. The whites were too organized, too strategic to expend energy pointlessly. They would not press their advantage immediately. They would wait. They would allow fear, starvation, and the mountain cold to weaken their opponents before delivering the second decisive strike. And winter was coming. The seasonal freeze, which normally drove them into deep, warm hibernation, would now be the enemy's greatest ally, transforming the entire mountain range into a gigantic natural storage facility for the whites' crystalline biology. Gray and Warg studied the terrain maps they had salvaged, tracing the path of the encroaching cold. They realized the mine shafts and ravines were merely local staging posts. The true epicenter of the frigid power, the source from which the whites had come, lay far to the north, in the realms of perpetual ice and snow. The Appalachians were simply their newest, most fertile beachhead for the harvest of thermal energy. The war had just begun. It was a fight for every degree of Fahrenheit, a desperate struggle for every molecule of moisture, and a defense against the absolute sterile emptiness that threatened to turn all of life in the Appalachian dark into a series of perfectly preserved white exhibits in a universe that had suddenly become too cold to bear. Their fragile alliance was the only thin, steaming boundary between enduring life and absolute petrifying silence.